Ready to call the meeting of the Mendocino County Advisory Redistricting Committee to order. Today's September 1st at 3:04 p.m. My name is Sherry Johnson and I'm with Mendocino County Executive Office. So I'm going to go ahead and conduct roll of the committee members. So you can just unmute when I call your name. So Paula Cohen.
Here.
Kyle Farmer.
Here.
Peter McNamee.
Here.
Dee Pallison.
Here.
Mary Ziadi.
Here.
And our alternate member, Brian Klofsky.
Here.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for your time and your commitment to the county service. So the next order of business, agenda item number 2, is the selection of chair and vice chair. So I'm going to turn it over to the commission to make your recommendations for a chair and a vice chair. So I guess the easiest way to do is I could just go in order of the roll call. So Paula?
Yes. To nominate somebody?
Yes, please.
And just to clarify,
Okay,
you
I'll
can nominate yourself. This
Oh,
is
good.
Charlotte Scott.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yeah.
Really? That sounds good. I'll nominate Kyle Farmer as chair.
Thank you. Kyle?
I don't feel prepared to nominate someone as chair.
Okay, thank you. Peter?
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Would you summarize the duties that are expected of the chair and the vice chair?
Yes, and then if I miss anything, Charlotte, please jump in. So the chair obviously would run the meetings, conduct the meetings, and in the absence of the chair, then the vice chair would run the meetings, and then also assist with the agenda. So we would prepare the agenda, but we would like input from the chair also. And just to keep the meeting running.
I would nominate Paula as the vice chair.
Okay, and do you have a nomination for the chair?
No, I think that we've already had one nomination. I'm happy with that one.
Okay, thank you. Dee?
Does anyone have experience chairing a Brown Act meeting?
I see a hand up from Peter. Is that a current
No, I'm
hand
just
up?
lowering my hand.
Okay.
Okay. Well, that being said, I think we can just go with who has already been nominated. I think it's fine with me. I don't want to be chair, so.
Great, thank you. Mary?
Hello. I actually was going to nominate Kyle, so I'm happy to second his nomination for chair.
Okay. All right, thank you. So we have a request for Kyle Farmer for chair and Paula Cohen for vice chair. So could I please get a motion to?
I so move.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, so I'll just do a vote. So Paula?
Okay, yes.
Kyle, oh, let me hold on before, and I apologize for this. I'm going out of order a bit. Clerk, was there any public comment on this item?
No public comment has been received.
Okay, thank you very much. So Paula, thank you. And then Kyle?
Is that something that I vote on, or do I
Yes,
recuse
yes.
myself in that case?
Yes, would you like to vote for you as chair and Paula
I
as
guess
vice
so. I
chair?
don't know what kind of coup you guys engineered.
All right. Peter?
Yes.
All right. Dee
Yes.
and Mary?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Kyle, so this is where we will pass it off, the meeting off to you. So as the chair, you will take over the meeting, and we're at item number 3, approval of the agenda. And please know that staff is here to assist you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And as Dee pointed out, it would have been great to nominate someone with experience running a Brown Act meeting. So apologies for everything I'm about to get wrong. But I do appreciate the opportunity to learn. So thank you, Paula. And thank you, the Law of Inertia. So we're on agenda item number 3, approval of agenda. I'd like to introduce the item and ask if there's any commission comment.
No.
Is that a collective no? Maybe we can, yeah, Paula, are you raising your hand?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I would make a motion to approve the agenda. Since there
Do
are
I have
no
a second?
changes anybody was recommending.
I will second.
Thank you, Mary.
Before we vote on agenda item 3, this is Nadia Tipton. We need to ask if there is public comment on this item. So no public comment has been received for item number 3.
Okay. So I'd like to put it to a vote. And maybe we can also put together a order at which to vote, or do we want to vote with icons or voice? I know that sometimes Zoom works better if we raise our hands, or do we want to say things? Does that matter?
This is Charlotte
Voice.
Scott, Assistant County Counsel. I would recommend in this time of Zoom, it's most appropriate to do a roll call vote and hear each person say yes, but the order is totally up to you.
Okay. I will do the order based on my particular Zoom screen. Peter or Clyde? It says Clyde first, but I thought your name was Peter.
It does. My full name is Clyde Peter McNamee, but I've always gone by Peter, and most people know me as that. I vote yes.
Paula?
I vote yes.
Dee?
Yes.
Mary?
Yes.
And Kyle, yes. So I think the vote passes unanimously. I'd like to move on to agenda item number 4, matters from the public. I'd like to invite members of the public to speak under the matter under jurisdiction of the commission, especially for items not already on the agenda. And if anybody has anything to say, it'll be unfortunately limited to 3 minutes.
We do not have any members of the public wanting to speak on agenda item 4.
Okay. So it looks like our next thing is going to be Ralph Brown Act training and an overview of the redistricting process. I'll turn that over to Charlotte, who's kind of nodding her head. Am I right?
Yes,
Okay, good.
we have some staff here. Sherry Johnson, of course. I think maybe Sherry, you could introduce. We could introduce all of the members of the staff who are here who may be providing comment or presenting in this presentation. I'll just start. My name is Charlotte Scott. I'm an assistant county counsel for the County of Mendocino. And I'm going to start with the Brown Act presentation, a little overview for you. I know this is new for many of you. And then also in addition to a few other staff members, we'll talk to you about the redistricting process in general and an overview of the process and the timelines and the criteria for this process. So Sherry, I'll go to you, and then I think Nadia, who is clerking for the meeting, is going to assist me by pulling up, sharing the screen of the presentation, which you may have already seen attached to the agenda item, but we will go through that slide by slide.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. So as I mentioned, I'm Sherry Johnson. I'm a deputy CEO with the Executive Office for the county, and oversight of the process, and would be the main contact for all of the commissioners. And I will let Leaf go ahead and introduce himself, but I'll also say that Katrina Bartlome, our assessor, county clerk recorder, will also be participating. She will be joining in just a little bit, so she's not on yet.
Oh, hello, commissioners. My name is Leaf Farr. I'm the GIS coordinator for Mendocino County, and I'll be helping you out with demographic data and mapping tasks.
All right, and then we have Nadia, who is Tipton, who is clerking the board. So thank you so much, Nadia.
And Nadia, when you're ready, if you could share your screen with the PowerPoint slides, that would be helpful.
Give me just a moment. Okay, it does not want to share the correct screen, so let me move it over. We'll do it a different way. Okay, so my computer does not want to show the whole Zoom, the slideshow properly. So can everybody see this and all of our slides?
I see it just fine. Thank you. All right. So let's start with, we've introduced ourselves. Let's start with slide 2, please. And so as I said earlier, we're going to have 2 parts to this training. The first part is a general overview of the Brown Act to kind of help you guide in your process, your participation as an advisory commission to the Board of Supervisors, a legislative body for which the Brown Act applies. And then the second part, we'll go over the redistricting process. Slide 3, please. So it's always useful to have a little bit of historical context when we talk about laws. And for the Brown Act, as you see from the slide, it was enacted in 1953. And a little interesting tidbit is that in the late 1951, there was a San Francisco Chronicle reporter who spent 6 weeks looking into how local agencies in San Francisco were conducting their meetings. And he discovered that even though there was already an existing law that said public business should be done in the public, he discovered that there were a lot of secret meetings and caucuses among public officials. And so he wrote a 10-part series that was in the San Francisco Chronicle in 1952. And out of that series came a decision to push for this new state law. And the bill was then drafted by Assembly Member Ralph M. Brown, and he agreed to carry it, and it passed and was signed by then Governor Earl Warren in 1953. The Brown Act has evolved quite a bit over the years, but there are some real central tenets that have stayed and have remained intact. One other interesting note is that the Brown Act came before the Freedom of Information Act, something that I'm sure many people have heard of, which was in 1966 and really governs only federal agencies. And another point to that is that that originated from a legislator from California. So it may have had some, the Brown Act may have had some impact on the federal act as well. Next slide, please. So we're going to go over a few different categories. Of course, the purpose, to whom the act applies, what constitutes a formal meeting, a meeting that triggers the Brown Act rules, basic notice and agenda requirements, and then just an explanation that during this time of COVID, the governor has made it possible through an executive order for public bodies such as the Board of Supervisors, and in this case, an advisory commission to the board, to conduct the meeting through this process now, the video conferencing process, and to acknowledge some of the rules that normally govern Brown Act as in terms of having the physical location of a public meeting, and waive some of those rules during this time when we're dealing with a pandemic. That may change in the near future, but that is still the current status of the law. So next slide, please. So the purpose, the express purpose of the Brown Act is to assure that the local government agencies conduct the public's business openly and in the public, and it's broadly construed in favor of greater public access and narrowly construes the exceptions to that. Next slide, please. To whom the act applies. So actually, I'll preface this by saying along the lines of the purpose, generally public officials should think of themselves as living in a glass house, and that they may only draw the blinds when it's in the public interest to preserve confidentiality. And so that is, along the lines of the exceptions to the public meeting are very narrowly construed. So to whom the Brown Act applies, let's go to the next slide. It applies to legislative bodies, and that includes, as you well know, the Board of Supervisors, and then any body, regardless of whether it's permanent or temporary, advisory or decision making. Next slide, please. So, and on the point of subsidiary bodies, being an advisory commission to the Board of Supervisors, that means the Brown Act does apply to your meetings, and that's why this meeting today and all future meetings will be public meetings following the Brown Act. So Brown Act, the main component of it is, what is a meeting? That's what tells you when it applies. So a meeting, and here in the slide, you'll see the definition from the statute. It's any congregation of a majority of members of a legislative body at the same time and location, including by teleconference, and in which you hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action on anything that is the subject matter of your body. So in this case, the redistricting process. The term meeting isn't necessarily limited to gathering together and taking an action, like voting on an item. It really includes that deliberative process, that discussion of positions and debate. Next slide, please. So the meetings include face-to-face meetings, and when a majority of you gather at the same time and place to discuss topics that are part of your jurisdiction. It includes retreats. It can include serial meetings, and it can include video teleconferencing like we're doing right now. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the board doesn't have to be formally convened, and your deliberations and any debate on an issue and on any vote, which may ultimately be taken, are covered. Next slide, please. So serial meetings, one of the distinct prohibitions in the Brown Act is that a majority of the members may not, shall not, outside of a meeting, formal public meeting, use a series of communications of any kind directly or through intermediaries to discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item of business that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. So serial meetings are when at one time, maybe less than a majority of the body discusses or meets on an item, but then it eventually snowballs into a majority. And so there are a couple of different examples of that. The daisy chain example would be member A contacts member B, then contacts member C, and so on. And in those discussions are deliberations over a certain item, and which ultimately is a majority, a quorum of the body's members. And the other example is the hub and spoke, which is member A contacts members B, and then C and D, and so on. And once a quorum has been contacted and items have been discussed or deliberated, that could result in a serial meeting, which is prohibited. It also another example is if a staff member reached out to each member or a majority of the members of the commission to discuss or deliberate on an item in a proposed action. The problem, of course, with serial meetings is that it deprives the public of an opportunity for meaningful observation and participation in the legislative body decision-making process. And this does happen. It can happen through using technological devices. So it's important to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. What is not a meeting? These are the exceptions to Brown Act. So individual contacts are not prohibited. So it doesn't prohibit one of the members acting on his or her own behalf and having a conference or discussion with a constituent, an advocate, a consultant, a part of the staff, though that isn't prohibited. Another example is attending conferences. A legislative body can attend, the majority can attend a conference or similar gathering that's open to the public, that addresses issues of general interest. You can also attend community meetings. And the key factor here is that as long as you do not discuss among yourselves, other than as part of a scheduled item in that program or public meeting, that would not be a violation of the Brown Act. And also social and ceremonial events, of course, you can all attend a social or ceremonial event. And as long as you're not discussing matters of redistricting among yourselves in that event, then there is not an issue with the Brown Act. The test isn't whether a majority of you were present, it's whether the business of a specific nature, the redistricting discussions happen at that event. So as long as no business is discussed, there's no violation. Next slide, please. Notice and agenda. So this is something you are learning about today. So for regular meetings, we have to have a noticed agenda that's publicized. You'll see we have that published on our redistricting page. And we, according to the Brown Act, we must post those at least 72 hours before the meeting. And the agenda has to have enough of a description so that it is understood what item is going to be discussed. And in the case of redistricting, we actually, our agendas, we will publish even more than 72 hours in advance, because there is a section in the election code that addresses having them posted 5 days before the meeting. So that's what we will endeavor to meet. And there may be some exceptions to that as we get closer to the end of our time period here in the redistricting process, and we can explain those as we get to that point in the time crunch that we are all having with this item. Next slide, please. So this will tell you more about when the board can act or discuss items. Sometimes an item might come up that was not on the agenda. It really, the rule is to have an item agendized, published, so the public knows what you're going to be talking about, discussing, deliberating, and acting on. Sometimes though, if you are, and this won't likely come up for the Redistricting Commission, but it can, perhaps we posted today's agenda and something interrupted today's meeting and we didn't get to finish the agenda, or we had to continue it and we decided to continue the meeting to another date in the next 5 days. That would be an example of where we wouldn't have to meet the 72-hour notice requirement. Another example is emergency items, something that came up. I don't foresee that as well for the Redistricting Commission, but important to know. And sometimes when that happens, if there is an item that there is a need for immediate action, we then discuss that. We would discuss that at the beginning of the agenda and have the board vote, 2/3 vote, to determine if that need for adding something late to the agenda, something which has come to your attention after the posting of the agenda, should be added to the present meeting agenda. Next slide, please. The next 2 slides talk about the general rights of the public that are acknowledged in the Brown Act. It's important to have meetings open and public, to not have conditions on attendance, to be able to record the meeting and proceedings, to be able to inspect recordings made of the proceedings. Next slide. If one requested a mailed copy of the agenda, that we would do so. Next slide, please. Okay, so public access to documents. All agendas of public meetings, all documents that are distributed on an item that's being considered. So for example, this slide presentation was distributed and posted with the agenda, and so the public can see it as well. And the only exceptions would be within the PRA Public Records Act, and there's exceptions when something is confidential. I don't foresee there being such items being considered by the Redistricting Commission. Typically, those are related to things like personnel considerations and existing litigation. You would probably recognize that from Board of Supervisors meetings when there are items that are considered for closed session. Next slide, please. As part of the Brown Act, it's important to acknowledge the public's right of input, their right to provide public comment. And so at each meeting, we will be requesting if any member of the public has any comment, and then on each item, of course, on specific items on the agenda. Next slide, please. And as I described earlier, there are items that are not on the agenda. The board should not take any action unless there's an emergency or immediate need, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So Governor Newsom just declared a state of emergency due to the COVID pandemic, and that, as I mentioned earlier, and he has suspended some of the requirements of the Brown Act. So that is why we are able to meet today by Zoom. Next slide, please. So there are sanctions for violations of the Brown Act. I won't get too much into this, but there are, if there's intentional violations of the act, there could be criminal violations. A member of the public could sue to stop an agency or board if it believed there to be violations or threatened violations. And in the process of any such lawsuit, there could be fees and costs. Next slide, please. Public Records Act, I mentioned a little bit earlier, but it's something to keep in mind through your work on this commission. It's an act that ensures the access for the public to information concerning your business and the Board of Supervisors business and also public agencies at the counties. And all of the county's records must be disclosed to the public upon request unless an exemption applies. And those exemptions are somewhat narrow as well. This could include email messages, text messages, notes, anything kept in the ordinary course of business that pertains to the work. And so it's always a good practice to draft communication carefully and thoughtfully, just keeping in mind if you're writing about redistricting and your work on this commission, if there is a potential for it to be disclosed to the public if so requested and if no exemption applied. Next slide, please. Here's just a couple of resources for you if you wanted to look up more about the Brown Act or the Public Records Act. And next slide, please. We'll go into the redistricting overview. But before we do that, are there any Brown Act questions that you may have? And keep in mind, if you had a question, it doesn't have to be just today. Please let staff know, and we can help you with that. All right. So we'll talk about really the main purpose of your participation today, and that's the redistricting.
Oh, Charlotte,
process.
I think Kyle has a question.
I apologize. I didn't see the hand raised or
no
see
worries.
that.
I was trying to figure out how to digitally raise it. I just wanted to clarify: is there anything is the Brown Act purely within the web of this board, or are there restrictions about sort of engagement as an individual with some sort of other entities? If
No,
there is
only
nobody else from this board at a particular meeting, for example.
Your participation as a commissioner in this advisory redistricting commission, that's the only application of the Brown Act specific to you in your role as a commissioner. You as an individual may have other individual meetings you would like to have. It doesn't apply to your life. It applies to the purpose and process for this commission and your actions taken specific to this commission and meetings specific to the work of this commission.
So if I was at another meeting and someone is expressing their opinion to me about redistricting, that would not be appropriate under the Brown Act?
No, I didn't mean to suggest that. You can have receive a good way to make sure, though, that everything that might be shared with you as an individual is also open to the public or shared with the public, is to also recommend that individual share their comments and feedback with the commission as a whole by sending, an email to we set up a redistricting commission email address. So you can also recommend that that individual communicate with the whole board so that is shared with everyone. Someone expressing their opinion to you is not a violation of the Brown Act. You discussing and sharing perhaps your decision, what you think you might do, the decisions you might make as part of this commission, I would recommend limiting any of such discussions to the public meeting.
Okay.
Thank you for your question. All right, so anyone else have a question about the Brown Act? And I'll let Sherry, will you let me know because I don't see everybody in my view.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So part 2, this is the redistricting process. And a lot of this, I want to preface this by saying it's a bit complicated. There's a lot of criteria and laws that are apply because the state of California made a lot of changes in the last couple of years in an effort to make the process more public and to make sure that the communities of, for example, our county are able to fully participate and that the criteria and the general themes of redistricting are really addressed fully and thoroughly by the commission and advising the Board of Supervisors. So this is just a summary of each of the items we'll go over today. What is redistricting? Why does it matter? Your role as an advisory commission, the criteria. So you'll see a little later on, but the criteria, the state has created criteria and it is ranked in order of priority. And we'll do our best to help you as you go through that if questions come up, but we'll go through those criteria. They're ranked in order of priority. And then we'll also talk about the census data. Lee Farr, who's from GIS mapping for the county, he has the most experience in the county with this process. He's worked on previous years of redistricting in the preceding decades. So he's also going to talk to you about how it might look both the census data and how the tools for mapping as we get the fully released official data from the Federal Census Bureau. And then we'll talk about the methods, communities of interest, how those can be submitted now, and the methods for line drawing, mapping the districts, a brief timeline of what we estimate for now that may adjust as if certain data is available sooner, maybe this will adjust, but given our short period of time that we have, the short window we have to finish and complete the maps and have the board vote on the maps, we're looking at a pretty condensed timeline. And then we'll have Katrina come on and talk about what happens next, what happens once those lines are drawn, so you have an idea of the next steps for the county and for elections. And of course, if you have any other questions, we'll go through those as well. So next slide, please. So what is redistricting? Redistricting, as you all may already know at this point, is the process local governments use to redraw political district boundaries. And it applies to all levels of government, US House of Representatives, our state legislature. There's a California Redistricting Commission that's handling that process right now. And also our County Board of Supervisors and supervisorial districts, and that's what you'll be working on. The general premise, it's based on the idea of one person, one vote. And it's a fundamental principle of democracy to make sure that everyone's voices are fairly represented by creating districts that have the same number of people. An overriding concern is total population equality. And this process happens every 10 years. And based on California law, it has to be we have to use the official census data that is collected every 10 years. And that data will account for some of the changes in our population over the last 10 years. And counties, unlike congressional districts, do not require perfect equality. There is some acceptable deviation, but the goal still is to achieve near equal population. Next slide, please. And so why does redistricting matter? So obviously how district lines are drawn influences who runs for political office and who's elected. And it's important to achieve near equal representation because of the historical context of how lines have been drawn in a way that may have minimized voting rights and may have prevented voters from electing the candidate of their choice. So you may have heard of gerrymandering. That is when officials reconfigure districts to favor a political party, an incumbent, or a candidate, and it often creates advantages for certain particular interests and ignores others. That's another reason why this process is so important to prevent that. You may have also heard of the Federal Voting Rights Act, which prohibits the dilution of racial and language minority voting rights by denying an equal opportunity to nominate and elect candidates of their choice. So the Federal Voting Rights Act addresses that history of discrimination by protecting communities during all stages of the electoral process, including in this drawing of redistricting and drawing of maps. And one way it addresses that issue is the Federal Voting Rights Act prohibits the dilution of racial and language minority voting rights by denying an equal opportunity for racial and language minorities to nominate and elect a candidate of their choice. And they attempt to remedy this issue by requiring the creation of minority districts if a minority group can form the majority of a single member district. And
Charlotte, sorry, excuse me, we have one question from Commissioner.
Absolutely.
McNamee.
I don't hear you, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're muted.
There we go, thank you. Yeah, my question goes to the language at the last bullet on your slide. I read that, and I hope that you would spend a little time talking about that. In particular, that language sort of suggests, and I'm not saying that it clearly suggests, but it sort of suggests that that we have an obligation to form a minority district, a single member district, if it otherwise complies with the law. Can you clarify what that means? Or are we talking about essentially, as long as the districts reflect the minority proportions equitably in the district as, say, compared to the county, would we have met that test?
So I'll explain the context of the Federal Voting Rights Act criteria is really dealing with a situation in which we may have a race or language minority group that comprises or could comprise a majority of a population of a district. So that is when there is this affirmative duty to draw districts in a way if groups are, let me get to my slide on that. So if a minority group is sufficiently large and geographically concentrated enough to make up a majority of a district, then and they have like a cohesive purpose and could potentially vote for a candidate that they choose as a group, that is when we need to make this effort to create those majority minority districts. And I know that's a little obtuse, but when we finish the criteria and we get to this process, one of the things we look at is the demographic data for our county, and we address and assess whether there have been changes such that there may be perhaps a district that has 51% of a language minority group, and we want to make sure then that we're not drawing or redrawing the lines in a way that separates, dilutes that, cracks the district in such a way to make it that minority majority could not vote for a candidate of their choice. And so I hope that helps to answer the question. It's as this one line from the case says, it's required only if that minority group can form the majority of a single member district. And of course, and ordinarily race is not something that can be the sole factor when making districts, but it can be a factor when we're trying to comply with this mandate from the Voting Rights Act. I hope that helps answer your question.
Well, if I might, and I don't want to belabor this because we're at the very front end of the process, and I'm sure we'll spend more time on this, but what I hear you saying is, let's say you had a language minority community in the county that composed at the county level, say 20% of the total county. But because that community is compacted into one geographic location, in that area, it might constitute 80% of a particular area in the county. So the prohibition would be that you couldn't go in and just divide up that community into several districts in order to get parity overall with the county. You'd have to respect the fact that that language minority community, because of its compactness geographically, would need to be in as few districts as otherwise made sense.
Yes, I think you've got that right. The key is a geographically compact minority community or language minority group. That is a key factor. So if the minority group or language minority group is spread throughout the county and isn't in a compact area, then there isn't this the Federal Voting Rights Act obligation that we've been talking about.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. Next slide, please. So what is the role of your commission? And I think you all are pretty well aware that you were appointed by the Board of Supervisors, and your role is said in the title, Advisory Redistricting Commission. So you are going to advise the board. You're going to facilitating this community outreach and helping to identify those communities of interest that the public tell you about, and provide recommendations to the Board of Supervisors on the placement of the county supervisorial district boundaries. And we are going to be doing that through a series of workshops and public meetings, receiving public comment, and then at the point of drawing the maps, once you've narrowed down to a few maps that you approve, you can then present those to the Board of Supervisors, and the Board of Supervisors ultimately votes and retains the authority to determine those districts by their final vote. But as an advisory commission, it's the board has made clear that they want to hear from you, and they want to take your advice. And this is why they've appointed you and created this advisory redistricting commission. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's a criteria, there's an order of priority for these criteria. And these are just summarizing that order. And I'll get into the next slide, please, to go into each of those criteria. So we started to talk about this already, but the federal criteria that we consider is that population equality. And so the state has clarified that in order to achieve that population equality, we need to use the official census data from the 2020 census. And for counties, there isn't a set, in the statute, there isn't a set number of how each district must, how close to equal population you must get. There is a little bit of case law that indicates your total planned deviation should not be, you want to achieve total planned deviation of less than 10%. And when we get to, and Leif may be able to explain how that's achieved when he talks about the data, but that's our general goal, that first overarching goal of population equality. And that comes from the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment also says no racial gerrymandering, and that's and that is obviously a prohibition from the Constitution. The 15th Amendment and the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act as I mentioned earlier, talk about prohibiting any dilution of racial language minority voting rights, and that process or that potential dilution can be evidenced by, and you may have heard of these terms before, but packing or cracking what could otherwise be a majority minority district. And this often is an issue and can be an issue in larger urban counties with sizable concentrated minority populations. So for example, cracking would be spreading minority voters too thinly into several, like taking one group that might be a majority in one district and splitting it into 3 districts. That would be cracking that, diluting that minority vote. Packing is an example when districts are drawn in such a way that maybe a minority community could comprise a majority in 2 districts, but they're pushed together in a kind of a circle around them to prevent them from having any more than a majority in 1 district. So those are evidence violations of the Voting Rights Act. So while race cannot be a predominant, the sole factor in defining a district, it can be considered when we're dealing with Voting Rights Act compliance, and it can be considered in addition to other factors. So when you're hearing community of interest testimony, you want to ask questions and learn more, and to see if there are other things other than race that just bind a community together. But there often is many other categories of common interests that bring them together. Economic, income, a lot of different issues can bring communities together. Next slide, please. And this goes into the state criteria, which are ranked. So we will be looking at contiguity. This is where we try to keep areas of a district connected. So you wouldn't want a district circle and then have a little circle at some distance far away and say that not connected is part of the same initial district. You also want to avoid having too much points, districts that just end or start at a point. That's something to keep in mind. The second criteria is one that you probably hear a lot about, and that's minimizing division of local neighborhoods and communities of interest to the extent practicable. So a community of interest is, a neighborhood, a community, or group of people who have common policy concerns and would benefit from being maintained together in a single district. And this is where you'll hear the stories of our community and the communities of interest within the county. The next criteria, before we switch off of this, we'll be hearing stories from the community and the communities of interest. This criteria, it's like the building blocks for each of the districts. And we want to consider this community of interest testimony and information that's provided to you, connecting it to interests that are concerns for the county government level. So for example, you wouldn't want a community of interest to be limited to a group of people who care about the federal income tax. Well, that wouldn't really be a community of interest for the county level. You'd want something more specific to that ties a community and to the county, to where they are located, and a concern that is addressed at the county level. One prohibition is that we aren't permitted to consider communities of interest that are tied solely to political parties or incumbents or political candidates. Next slide, please. The third ranked criteria is keeping together the geographic integrity of our cities and the census designated places in the county. And I just listed some of those. If you look them up on the census provides these places, there's a list of them. Here they are in alphabetical order. So is there part of your analysis will be trying to keep together these cities and the census designated places. But keep in mind, this is ranked criteria. So if there are certain higher ranked criteria that require some division or of a city or a census designated place, that can occur. We will see that as we get gather our data and you start on the process of drawing the maps and trying to maintain the higher ranking criteria of like the fairly equal population and the like. The next criteria is easily identifiable boundaries. And so these would be things like natural boundaries, rivers, canyons, mountains, and of course, artificial barriers like highways, railroad tracks and the like. And then the fifth criteria is geographic compactness. So you want to, and this is actually in the statute, but trying to maintain areas so we're not bypassing nearby populated areas in favor of more distant areas. This is like, if you see if there's a funny shaped district that has, it looks like maybe a dandelion or a daisy, like there's lots of turns and loops, and like that might be something where we're wanting to take another look at that. We may be able to draw the district boundaries more compact, but again, this is all to the extent practicable. There are certain the districts can be drawn and have some curves and turns, especially if that's necessary to meet the other high ranking criteria. And then finally, we aren't permitted to consider political parties as the criteria for drawing maps. Next slide, please. So now I'm gonna pass this on to Leif Farr, because he's sort of our resident expert on the data and interpreting the data that we will get, and on the mapping process when we are at that stage.
All right, so this slide is about census data. And
Leif, before you start, I just wanted, excuse me, is there any questions from the commissioners on Charlotte's presentation? Any questions?
I do have a quick question. It does kind of to follow up on Peter's question. Clearly, those are things that we should not be sort of trying to make happen, but it is sort of a staff job to a certain extent, because we won't necessarily have the technocratic capacity to not make those things happen, right? In terms of these sort of harder demographic questions, or are those things that if we start working on a map, then it's our responsibility to be looking at those and making sure they don't happen? Or is that a sort of a staff problem?
I would say it would probably be a joint effort.
Okay.
Exactly. It's not like staff is saying this is your recommended map. We are relying on you as the commission to help guide testimony from the public and discuss how those maps, how those communities, how you want them to be kept together, meeting the criteria. And so, for example, Leif will talk more about this, but in public meetings, we hope to be able to have it be interactive, where we have staff there to help you in the creation of maps and moving maps around to show how the population changes if we draw it in a certain way. And so we're there to help guide you, but ultimately we're really looking to you to make the decisions on ultimately on the draft maps you want to present to the board.
But is there some sort of watchdog advocate on behalf of any sort of accidental violations we might be putting forth?
So
I mean, how does that usually end up getting discovered if somebody if that's...
Well, I think so. Here, let me back up a little bit. So part of the reason why this process is in the public, and everything is done through presentation of, like, for example, testimony regarding community of interest, and then your discussions as a board about, I really want to see that this community of interest is kept together, and decisions on that, as to creating the maps, and then also on the actual creation of the maps, we're going to rely on the board on the commission to help guide that, and then what the mapping, what Leif and his team would help create the maps and present to you. Perhaps if we include this community, then we're then running afoul of the 10% deviation, or we're definitely going to do our best to help answer questions or point out, if we can, issues that may come up. But throughout the process, it's all documented. As long as, so these are ranked criteria, it's not likely that you're going to run afoul, as long as you're making every effort to, as a commission, to follow the criteria and prepare maps that meet the criteria. It wouldn't be necessarily I would not expect that a member would, that the public, after the maps are drawn or drafted, would discover some glaring error that was intentional, or that was made that deviates from the criteria to an extent that we can't document. We've done our best with the information we have, with the information presented to us by the communities. I don't think it's a black and white issue in terms of following the criteria. That's why they're ranked. That's why there's a lot of considerations.
There is some tests for the Voter Rights Act, if you're going astray of that, called the Jingles factors. And there are 3 of those that you can apply to any draft map that comes up. And with the demographic data that we're supposed to use, you can check that, and we will be checking that to make sure we don't go afoul of that, the Voter Rights Act.
The computer's got our back.
Well, your eyes and ears are your best bet there.
Thank you for that question, and I'll give it back to Leif unless anyone has another question.
Okay, census data. There's a couple of different files in the census data that we're required to use. The Public Law 94-171 data file that comes from the decennial census, and in this case, the 2020 census. It usually comes out in April after the census. April, in this case, would be 2021. We have not received that data as of yet in a usable format. Legacy data was released a couple of weeks ago, but it's not in a usable format. It has to be processed. And one of the criteria that we have in the state of California is we have to use the Public Law 94-171 file that's adjusted by the state for inmate population. That the state's telling us that we may not have that data until September 30th or the end of the month. And, you know, there may be a situation where we can get that mid-September, but I think we have to plan for the fact that that state adjusted data won't come out till the end of September. The census data is an actual count of people. It happens at a specific point in time. And that is down to the block geography level, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But just remember that the block geography is the smallest area they tabulate statistics for. So we use that smallest area to give us the best granularity in the units we use to move around to construct these supervisorial districts. In the past, we've done this a little differently, and we can go over that later as we get more into the process, but the blocks are the smallest unit you can use. And I'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about geography. The other data file that we have is the American Community Survey, or what they call ACS. That is also from the Census Bureau, but it's derived from surveys averaged over a 5-year period. And the data file that we have to use there is what they call the Citizens Voting Age Population, or CVAP. This data is used for analysis and determining the requirements for the majority and minority districts under the Voting Rights Act, which we just had that discussion on. So when you're looking at who are the, you know, the minority populations, you're not actually using the census data, you're using the American Community Survey data, and you're looking at citizens of voting age, in other words, 18 years and above. The data we have to use for determining whether or not we have equal populations is that Public Law 94-171 data, which is an actual count of people, and it's the total count of all people, regardless of age, in the county. So that is what we're going to be using as far as data. And let's see, pretty much covered all that. Can I have the next slide, please? So geography, there's two types of geography that we data for. Primarily, we have what they call census geography, and then there's political geography. Political geography is pretty obvious. It's the state, the county, incorporated cities. All of those entities have legal boundaries. And in the case of our unincorporated communities, the Census Bureau has established what they call census designated places, which are towns, villages, and communities. Unincorporated communities don't have a legal boundary. So in terms of tabulating and consistency in demographics, the Census Bureau has established a certain amount of census designated places. And you'll see a map of that shortly. Census geography is nested geography. In other words, the county, within the county, you have a number of census tracts, which are the larger areas. You'll have block groups, which are nested inside. So a census tract is broken down into block groups. And then block groups are in turn broken into blocks. And a block is what it sounds like. A city block, an area bordered by 4 streets, could be a square or rectangle. And that's how that was established. Unfortunately, in rural counties and in rural areas where you don't have a gridded street plan, like most of Mendocino County, block boundaries are drawn on physical features that you can see out in the field, such as power lines, roads, creeks, ridge lines. And each of these geography have a population limit. So the sparser the population, the larger area of that geographic unit has to be. So we have some blocks that are very large, just as we have block groups that are very large and census tracts that are very large, because there's not that many people that live out there. And so you have to have a large area to get enough people to tabulate to be able to tabulate demographic statistics for a geographic area. Because the Census Bureau limits this to the larger the area, the more detailed statistics they're going to tabulate for that area. And so you have to have a large number of people, so you don't disclose detailed information about individuals. But for blocks and the data we're going to use things like population, what the Census Bureau calls their racial categories, white, black, Asian, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, other, and then 2 or more, which they have now multiple racial categories. But those are the basics that we use. And primarily, we're just going to be looking at total population counts, and you'll see that as we go along.
I believe we have a question for you from Commissioner McNamee.
Yes.
You know, you may be getting into some of this later on in your presentation, but this seems like as good a place as any for me to ask this question, and it's one I've been wondering about. I note here that you haven't gotten the data that we're waiting for to actually do the reapportioning of the districts. But has there been any attempt to look at the existing district lines based on the data that we do have to determine whether or not they remain in compliance with the redistricting legal requirements?
Well, there's 2 pieces of information there. One is we do know what the population was for each of those in 2010 data. That's the current districts and the population they had in 2010 when they were formed in 2011. We've recently received 2020 census data for the county as a whole and the 4 incorporated cities and census tracts. So we can look at that and we can see what we're going to determine is, and this gets back to that 10% rule. The 10% rule is, in looking at population equality, is that your least populated supervisorial district should not be more than 10% different than your highest populated district. And the best way to achieve that is what we do is we take the total population of the county, which the Census Bureau is now saying is 91,601 people. We divide that by 5 for the 5 supervisor districts. We get an average. And your best practice would be to equal that population in each district so that any district is less than 3% deviation from the average. So that means, by the end, if your highest is 2.5 above the deviation from the average and your lowest is 2.5, then you're only 5%. It's not a good idea to go all the way up to 10% because then, folks who are dissatisfied with your boundaries have more of a case for litigating that. You want to stay way under 10% difference between the highest populated and the lowest populated districts. And the way we've always done that in the past, and it works well, is to look at that average and use our tools that are available to us when we move areas around to produce these districts, or to look at examples of districts that the public submit, which is what we'll be doing. We'll be looking at public submitted district lines and calculating statistics to see how they pan out. Is to make sure that we're a certain percentage deviation away from the average for each district. Hopefully that might have answered your question. If not, I'll try to elaborate more if it did not.
I just would assume that one of the alternatives we would consider would be the existing boundary lines. And then what we would need to know is whether or not those boundary lines meet the criteria that are established under the reapportionment laws as they exist today.
Okay, well, I think I can give you
I was sort of asking
more
about
information.
Do we know, I'm sorry,
If you take,
do we know at this point whether or not they comply in terms of population distribution?
yes and no. If
Yes
you
and
take
no.
the average, given the total population of the county, it's 18,320. That's, again, remember, that's not adjusted for inmate population, but if we're just using that figure, there are 2 districts that are say less than 3% deviation from that. And depending on what the growth numbers are, there's a third that may be pretty close. There's probably 2 districts, depending on the growth patterns of the last 10 years, that may or may not be have enough population.
I see. Thank you. That clarifies the question for me.
All right.
May I just add to that first before we take Kyle's question? Just to add that while you may hear from the public that an interest in maybe maintaining the current districts, and while that it may be that population, if let's say, for example, there wasn't enough deviation that required any change in the districts for purely population reasons to achieve that near equal population. Even if that's the case, there's still part of this process requires that we go through as a commission, that you go through with the public and collect information to hear more from the communities. So we would not recommend making a decision based solely on that alone. Of course, we would want to go through this process as mandated by the state law to hear from the community and to go through each of the criteria. That is not to say that it cannot be that perhaps our districts are very similar in the end. It's just there's a process we need to go through, and that is what you're doing through your advisory commission. Thank you.
And
I would just add
Chair
to that,
Farmer has,
if I can, that it's not so much the lines themselves, because 10 years have gone by, and the first thing we have to do is ask folks what they now think is their community of interests. But in terms of the current boundaries, not to look at them so much as lines, but understand there's a rich history of past testimony about communities of interest, with the idea that they may be the same as today, or they may have changed, and you don't know until you ask people the question. So.
and the chair had a question, Lee.
In past years, with the census data being available earlier, are these public submittals from people or organizations that have taken into account census data, or are they sort of purely looking at the community of interest question? Are they doing that data work or GIS work themselves in those submittals?
There are organizations and groups that are doing both.
And in this year, we would assume that really won't be possible till towards the end. And so it seems like the community meetings are going to be happening at a more abstract level, because we won't have the real data until a little bit later. Is that what I'm hearing?
In a sense, there are applications out there that counties are using, but the data source that they're using is not what's required to be used. So they're using the American Community Survey data. A common, I was going to get into this in my next slide, but you asked the question now, so I'll try to relate that to you. There are some nonprofits that have mapping applications on the internet that will allow you to do both, to aggregate blocks into communities of interest and or draw district lines. We looked at the data, and unfortunately, it's survey data. And it's also, they use a methodology that's not necessarily approved by the Census Bureau to disaggregate that data down to the block level, because it's only tabulated for the next level up, which is the block group. So there's a bit of manipulation going on there. The problem is for the community survey data, they show a negative population growth for the county. In other words, they're showing less population in 2020 than they did in 2010. And when I looked at the data, it was individual small areas have error rates of 30 to 40%. That's even before it's disaggregated in their methodology to break it down by block. So we haven't used that data because we felt that, one, it's not accurate enough. And it was kind of justified when the census data came out for the county population to show that we actually did grow although just a small amount. It kind of gave us a sort of indication of not using that data, but it is out there and people are using it to get sort of a jump start on the process.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. So mapping tools. The county maintains a public GIS or Geographic Information Systems mapping gallery on a public website. And it has several different mapping applications where the public can look and view it data. It also has tools to create a PDF map, electronic file, and either print that out or store it or send it. So what we've done is we've added a redistricting map to one of those map applications. And let me see if I can show you that now. And it's not perfect, it's a work in progress, but we'll have a link to it on our redistricting site. And the idea right now is if a member of the public, and we have a tutorial that we're going to add to that as well to show you how to work through the tools. But you can go in, zoom in, draw your community of interest, create a PDF of that map, and then email it to the county's redistricting website. So that we can use that tool right now to start collecting communities of interest. Later, when the data comes out, we hope to add more to that so that folks can actually possibly use that to draw district lines if they so needed. That's what we have now, sort of pre-data tools. There's no population counts, no racial makeup counts. It's just primarily, you can use that right now to draft out your community of interest and submit it to the county. And you could send an email, attach it to an email, give a brief description of why you think it's a community of interest. And post data tools, we're gonna.
Leave, excuse me. Are you sharing? We're not seeing your screen.
I haven't shared it yet.
Oh, you have? Okay, I thank you. I wasn't sure.
But I haven't tried yet, so put it that way. I just wanted to go through this a little bit on post-data tools. It'll be the same interactive map, hopefully, with more data and more explanations and instructions. We do have an interactive GIS mapping tool that I'm hoping to use during your public meetings, that once we get the data and apply the data, we can then move blocks around to interactively look at what the population and racial makeup of those areas would be during a meeting if you so wish. And as I mentioned earlier, there are examples of public internet mapping tools from other organizations. District R is one that we've tried to contact a couple of times, and we're still hoping to see if they can get our county on their site, so that, because if you Google Humboldt County's and Sonoma County's site, they're using District R as one of the mapping tools where people can draft communities of interest or districts and send them in. So there's a few tools out there, and we're building those as we go along. Let me try to.
Lee, can I ask another question?
Yes.
I guess as a statement and a question, it just sort of occurred to me that this is probably all new. This is not something that kind of collaborative real-time work was probably not possible in past.
Actually, no, we had a similar tool in 2010.
Okay.
And when we did public workshops with the Citizens Advisory Committee, then we went to different communities and did our workshops locally. And we would bring, the laptop with the application and a screen and projector, and we could show examples of this and do interactive discussions and calculations as we spoke at those meetings. So
that's exciting.
I'm sitting here trying to figure out. I have just this screen up, but I'm trying to share my screen. Oh, here we go. Hey, can folks see this, our mapping portal?
No,
No,
not
we,
yet.
Now you should be
There.
able to. Okay, this is the county's public GIS portal. This is the front gallery. You'll see it has many different map applications. We're going to use this arrow here. We set up one just for redistricting, and the link on the website should just take you right to this map application when we have it set up. So you'll see here the current supervisorial district boundaries. There's things you can zoom in, zoom out, your typical web mapping thing. You can use the wheel to zoom in and zoom out. You can always get back to the original position by clicking on home. You have a set of tools here that I can briefly show really quickly. You can zoom to a location either by putting in an assessor parcel number, which hardly anyone knows their assessor parcel number, but you can zoom to a location just by address. So there's the county building right there. It zoomed us into it. I've only put 2 base maps on here for simplification. If folks, there's a tool down here, you can change this to an aerial image, or you can just change it back to the topographic map, some standard tools. This is a layer list. And if you click on a little arrow right here next to it, it tells you all the different layers that are on here. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. You can see the 2nd district, which is the smallest area of all the districts currently. There's an ellipse over here, a 3-dot ellipse. If you want to click on the map and see information for any one of these, then you just click on here and you enable pop-ups. So I just did incorporated cities. That's the yellow boundary you'll see here. You can always see what the symbol looks like there, or you can go up here and see what the symbols look like. Anything that you have. Here. So if I click on the city, it's going to highlight the city boundary. So you can see that the city of Ukiah is mostly pretty much entirely within District 2, and then there's some area outside of the city that's also in District 2. And you can see the total population for 2010 and 2020, just because we were able to get that data for 2020, I wanted to add it in there. We'll be adding in a lot more data on the racial categories and possibly voting age population as well. So, you know, one of those areas that you're supposed to try not to split up are incorporated cities. Another one is census designated places. We talked about that. And I can enable census designated place. So I can see here, here's the Talmadge, here's Ukiah. Each incorporated city is also a census designated place. We have Calpella. We have Redwood Valley, which is only a portion of Redwood Valley, and I don't know why, but that's, you know, the Census Bureau made some of these up themselves. Potter Valley, again, not all of Potter Valley, but one of the things we did see in the data that's come to us so far from the 2020 census is all 4 of our incorporated cities had a very slight population increase, except for the city of Fort Bragg, which had a greater population in 2010 than it does now in 2020. So that was interesting. And we've also looked at some of the census tract data that we have information for, and there are tracts that have less population in them than it did in 2010. So you can get an idea, see all the different census designated places, and you can see the incorporated cities. And what I sort of alluded to before is not so much the actual boundaries that you see on this map, but the fact that when you look at it, you'll realize that the last time around in 2010, the Citizens Advisory Committee did a pretty good job of maintaining all of these census designated places and incorporated cities within a district without trying to split them up. And that is not to say that you should pay attention to these lines, but there may be other comment by the public now that says, well, you know, one of the glaring things about this map is look at the 5th district. You know, it has the coastal communities in Anderson Valley, you know, and you can make a point that Anderson Valley has links to the coast, but then it also has Hopland. Well, it has Hopland. Hopland's been in and out of the 5th district decade over decade, just as Laytonville's been in and out of the 4th district decade over decade, depending on how the population grows within the county. It never grows uniformly. But, you know, the last time around, it was sort of, well, Hopland, they contained it all in one community of interest. And it has some ties to the same economic and agricultural goings on of Anderson Valley. So there's a link there, and then Anderson Valley has a link to the coast. So you know, there are ways of looking at this, and that's what the public expressed to us. So your task is looking at this and listening to what the public has to say, and then crafting a solution to that based on the criteria. And as we get into it, you'll see it's not always an easy task, but it's going to be a challenging one, but I think also a rewarding one. So this is just wanted to show you another. I want to turn some of these off really quickly. You can turn these on and off. Only show what you want to show. But I also placed a, this is the population density of the county. And you can click on that. You can see this is persons per square mile. So we have a lot of areas in our county that have very few people. And if you'll notice, you see these community names. Logically, that's where the population density is. And then you add your census designated places, and you can see that the communities themselves are where you have your population density. And you need to craft a solution that will hopefully not cut those up, but will group them into like areas and give you equal population. And again, this is a work in process. It's always going to be added to, it's to be changed. We're going to add more instruction. But I did mention that you can use this to look at communities of interest. And you may look at this and you say, well, this Hopland CDP, if I zoom in, I can actually see individual parcels, roads, everything's labeled. That pretty much is what I think my community of interest is. And then I could just say, I can send you an email saying the Hopland CDP is my community of interest, and this is why I think it is a community of interest. It could be as easy as that. Or, you know, you may want to draw a community of interest and submit that. So we do have a drawing tool here, and we'll have instructions on this, but you can. I just want to run this through real quickly to show you how I can do this. Say I wanted to start here, but I want to include some more area. To my community of interest. So I've drawn out my community of interest the way I think it is. Now I want to print this. We have a little print tool. It's not very fancy, but it's pretty easy to use. You can have a different size. In this case, I think I'm going to go with portrait. You can do the orientation. There's a few different sizes. You can choose what type of graphic file, but we have it set up for PDF because that's an easy one for folks to use. You can even do advanced, and you can pick a few more things. I can put, I can name it name on there so people know, spell my name, whose map it is. You just hit print, and what it does, it creates a PDF. And then I can take that PDF and I can save it. I can open it up here. So I can either print this out, I can save it to my file, but you can see it's Hopland, it's my community of interest, and that's the area. We have a link to submit data to the Redistricting Commission on the website, and we'll put that information on here so then they could just send an email, attach this PDF, and then we'll have their map of their community of interest. People can do this right now. It's up and running if they want to. And again, you know, if you go on there, you're not going to see in 2 minutes instruction right now because we're still working on that, and we're going to link that to this map as well. So it'll be improved as you go along. And that's a public mapping tool that you can use right now. And it's pretty easy. If you want to go back, you can just clear your print and you can make a new print, or you can go back to your drawing tool and you can clear that. You can undo things. And you won't hurt the map by drawing and undoing your own communities of interest, you know, and you can create that PDF and send it in or print it out, however you want to do it. So that's a quick run through of a mapping tool that's available to the public right now. I'm going to, and if you do click that off, it just takes you back to the gallery, and we'll probably have a link that goes right to this map so we won't confuse people with multiple choices of map applications, because there's quite a few here, different ones that we have for the public to look at. And I think that's the end of my talk at this point.
Okay, thank you, Leif. Does anybody have any questions for Leif? Chair.
I'm just curious. I mean, I don't know how much work it would be, but it would be possible to add a watershed layer to be able to see how those two interact, since it was talking about ridge lines as natural barriers. Is that
we can. I think primarily most people would be wondering why we had watershed boundaries on there. I know in a lot of land use planning applications, watershed boundaries are important to look at. We can certainly do that. It is, I shouldn't say that. I don't think I have it on any of the other map applications, but if that's something that you folks want on there, we'll certainly put it on. I know a lot of people identify with a specific watershed, and there's a couple of different watershed files. One is more generalized. They both come from the state, and one is very detailed. It breaks like the Russian River down into, you know, dozens of little minor watersheds like Lower Ackerman Creek, Upper Ackerman Creek. I don't know if that would be usable for most folks, but you know, we can put the less detailed one on there that shows Russian River, Eel, coastal watersheds, and see if that works. If folks wanted the more detailed one, then we could certainly add that as well.
I think that as we're seeing with these, you know, interbasin water transfer questions, whether it's Eel to Russian or Ukiah to the coast, you know, watersheds are an increasingly important part of our politics, and it would be just an interesting education tool, if nothing else, for people to be able to think about that in terms of what they're already thinking about in their communities of interest.
You might get folks who explain their community of interest by living in a watershed, but it's, again, you have to look at how granular you want to go down in that level. So
I certainly don't think upper and lower, but if they were using that mapping tool and could rather than having to try to follow the topographic map, be able to simply activate a layer that would be an interesting option for certain members of the public.
Commissioner McNamee?
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. That's been very enlightening. And I'm going to, before I know we have to discuss what happens after the mapping is completed, but it seems to me an appropriate time now to talk about something else, which is what you've been talking about is the need for public input in regard to communities of interest in order to fuel good decision-making in terms of redrawing the district lines. And so I would request that we consider what kind of a strategy we're going to initiate in order to educate the public about how they can express themselves and how that will fit into the decision-making process and the timing of that. And that's what I don't see in the presentation that we have before us today is some kind of written strategy for how we're going to do that. I believe we have a fair, because of the timeline, we're talking about our next meeting is September 7th, and then following that is going to be September 14th. We're going to have a presentation to the Board of Supervisors on the work to date. And I can imagine that we would want to have those questions not just answered, but actually implemented in some major way. And what I'm suggesting is a public relations outreach program to the public, asking them to provide this community of interest information to us and explaining to them why that's important and how they would go about doing it.
Yeah, oh, Charlotte, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was actually going to say, Sherry, if you're able to kind of explain how your office is handling outreach right now, I think that would be useful. And then I think when we look at the timeline, yes, as you noted, we have a condensed timeline, but all of the opportunities that we can have public workshop and public input are welcomed, and that public input can be by email through doing these mapping and filling out. You'll see the next slide that we have is a form. Perhaps we'll move to that. Yes, that members of the public currently can submit their communities of interest through this form that's located on the website, on the Redistricting Commission website. And so Sherry, if you had anything else to add in terms of how outreach is happening, that I think that would be helpful.
So yeah, we do have an email group of a media group that we do email the information to. And then we also have, when agendas become published, and we also have e-notifications that the members of the public can sign up for. So whenever there's a new agenda published or a meeting coming, they get notification. And I am going to defer to Nadia if you have some other, she's our expert with that. And she also posts to social media with Facebook. Am I missing, what am I missing, Nadia, on what else you're posting?
This is Nadia Tipton, Executive Office. I think you covered it. We have, like you said, we have our e-notification sign up. Anybody can sign up to receive e-notifications. We've designated redistricting as a news and calendar category on our e-notifications. So if you have not signed up for e-notifications, you can do that by going to our website, www.mendocinocounty.org. And there's a sign up button for notifications on the bottom of that screen. You can choose other categories, not just redistricting there as well. Anytime we send out press releases regarding redistricting, we use that system. We also post those to our county Facebook page. And if any information comes out regarding redistricting, that we may find helpful to the public, we will post that through the news system as well. We did set up a redistricting website for this redistricting process that is found on our website again, www.mendocinocounty.org, under Government Executive Office and then Redistricting. And that's where you can find shortly the GIS mapping tool will also be linked there, as well as public comment forms and telecomment forms. And that's also where our agendas and packets are linked and posted as well.
I just wanted to comment a little bit on the question, and that, you know, because of the times we live in, it's a little bit challenging. And the way we would handle this in the past is this redistricting commission would have town hall meetings in communities all across Mendocino County. And they would advertise the town hall meeting, and there was never any lack of people showing up. And then we explained what information we were seeking, and had a wealth of information that people would relate to us in a town hall meeting. We would record and come back, and then the commission would have their meetings to try to resolve some of those. They would look at the majority of input. I mean, you get input scattered all over the place, but usually, you know, the input from a given town hall meeting, there would be a majority of opinion, and they would look at that. The commission would look at that and try to draw maps that adhere to the that input. Unfortunately, in times of pandemics, we're, you know, a little restricted in how we do that. So in essence, that's a very good question. How do we get this information out there, and how do we get a response from the public?
Chair, I believe Commissioner Pallison also has her hand raised.
I just wanted to offer support for the watershed layer. I don't think it needs to be the very detailed one, just a simple one. But I think in the times that we're in and what people are looking at, I think that would be really important. I kind of got excited when Kyle suggested it. I think that's really important that we include that. And is there a chance, based on conversation after that, that we can have more meetings than have already been scheduled if we feel like we need them? Like, if we have a lot of input from the public, I just want to make sure that we have a chance as a group to digest all of that and make sense of it before we have to meet with the Board of Supervisors. Not sure how that's going to work, but I was just wondering.
I do believe we can have more meetings if this is this committee would like to. We can have more meetings. The ones we have scheduled are what the number that we are required to have scheduled.
And if I may add to that, to answer your question, it is the timeline draft timeline we created is actually a little more than the minimum required, and given the condensed time period, it is a little bit hard to calendar all of the meetings within the short period of time. However, we can increase, at your request, the public workshops. We may not be able to, we'd want to make sure that we address that soon so that we can then work on the process, the publicizing those meetings, and perhaps, I think it's the next agenda item. We have that timeline to be discussed, and any comment you have at that time. If you see windows that you'd like to schedule a meeting in, we can bring that back to you at the next meeting. We have one, I believe, next week.
Okay. So this is Paula, and I have a question.
Okay.
I just realized that maybe I'm supposed to be the one. Should I be saying, go ahead, Paula?
Yes,
Sherry's
but we're
job.
happy
Sure,
to
if you
assist
want.
you. Yes, we're happy.
So the interesting question that has been raised about getting information out there and developing the public awareness. Does the county have a number of articles they're putting out? I know there are other groups, League of Women Voters and such, that are have things that can be used that kind of explain the process and get them, we could share with media. And but I don't feel that as a commissioner, I necessarily can do that, but how would a process work where if I found something that might be interesting and how to get it out? Or is that something that I as a commissioner can do? Did that make sense?
Yeah, I'm going to turn that
Because
to
I mean,
Charlotte. Yeah.
there are things like listservs and other ways. So go ahead.
If I
Sorry.
may respond through the chair, thank you. So that is part of the county as a whole, and the county being the Board of Supervisors, the staff here helping, and your commission. Part of our duties is to conduct that outreach and to reach out to organizations, and perhaps League of Women Voters is one such organization that does have that knowledge and interest and is organized and around issues such as redistricting. I know that is something the county can do and add to its outreach, and I'm sure that we can help you with that, help the commission with that by adding them and reaching out to them, perhaps inviting participation at a public workshop as well.
Looks like Peter's had
I'm
his
thinking
hand
more
raised
like
for a
news
bit.
articles. Yeah.
Peter,
Yes,
were you hoping to
we can
speak?
assist with that. Sorry, Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, do I have the floor?
Go for it.
Thank you. Well, the follow-up question I have is, it sounds like you've done a lot of things, so that's great. There has been some effort put into reaching out to the community. Do we have input already that has been submitted for the commission to consider? Anyone on the staff want to respond to that?
This is Nadia Tipton, Executive Office. We have not yet received any public comment or input from the public regarding the redistricting process now.
Well, I realize that we're on a short time frame, and this competes with so many other important questions that the public has to address. And but I suspect that part of the issue is that they're just not aware at this point of the work of this commission and the relatively short time frame we're on. And so I guess I would suggest to my fellow commissioners that if we don't start to see some significant increase in public input that we'll need in order to make good decisions by our next meeting, then I think we should have an item on the agenda to discuss how we can do more public outreach to encourage the stimulation of that input that we need in order to make the decisions that we're going to have to make and have the public input that we're going to need in order to make those decisions wisely. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Looks like Dee has her hand raised, and then Mary just put her hand up too. But Dee, can you go ahead? You're still on mute, Dee.
Sorry, too many buttons to push. I just want to confirm that it's okay for us to share this information, like on our personal social media or whatever like that, anything like that. I think Paula had posed that question sort of, but I just want to make sure it's okay.
You can share information, and I would recommend against any kind of deliberation or discussion of how you plan to, proceed in your work on the commission. And so that would be, the only caveat. And then if I think one of the things you could do if people reach out to you individually is to refer them to email any comments to that redistricting email, and I don't have it in front of me, but Sherry or Nadia can reiterate that before the end of the meeting, so that public comments come not to you personally, but to the whole, to the commission and shared, so that anything that goes to that, any comment that is sent to that email address will then be uploaded. That's part of the county's process and being and meeting our requirements, is to share all of the public comment and keeping a log of every map that is drawn, whether handwritten or created like a PDF through the tools that Leaf showed you, and that all of the community of interest testimony that is saved and logged and shared.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Like I was thinking of this address that's shared on this communities of interest forms page. It's like if we just shared that and just said, make sure to tell us what you think or give us your opinion, not to engage in the conversation myself. So, but just to be part of the machine that gets the word out. That's all.
Mary, did you want to say something? Mary, you're still muted.
Okay. I miss the town halls too, but what I'm thinking is, could we for each area send out invitations to major organizations, be it the city, council, major groups within each organization that we know would say, come to a town hall, or at least giving a notification, or rather an invitation to attend a Zoom meeting, so that we're reaching out to each area. And we might even do it where every Zoom is open to comment from anybody, but that each meeting has a particular area that is being emphasized.
If I may help respond through the chair to that question, I think in that case, I think that what you can do is reach out to staff, the staff on this commission. We have Sherry who's facilitating this process for the staff, for the county staff, and say, I recommend that we reach out to these organizations and these other entities to invite public comment, and I'm sure that can be added and done by the county.
I just want to say we are reaching the end of our meeting time. It seems like as long as it's not a Brown Act violation to get in touch with staff to recommend promotion ideas, that we can just each individually reach out to staff and ask to give some sort of promotion ideas, including the radio. We have great radio hosts and Mendo Latino and such.
That's true.
But should we move on to confirming these dates so I can get my kids to horseback riding practice?
Yes, and Sherry, this is Sherry through the chair. Just the email address is redistricting@mendocinocounty.org. So each of you could send any of your comments or your suggestions to that, and you could also send it to to me personally too. So I think you all have my contact information. And so Chair, I'll go through the timeline redistricting process. We have just up there where we have the public workshop that is on September 7th, and that is at 6:15. That's an evening meeting. And then on the next, we have the Board of Supervisors meeting on the 14th. So and then we have, I won't read every one of them to you, but you can see we have a variety of public workshops, and we have the board meetings, and then we have final map approvals, which we will be asking the board for a special Board of Supervisors meeting. It looks like we're going to be asking for November 18th as a special meeting. And December 7th, we have as the introduction after the final maps. We will be asking for an introduction of an ordinance, and then the 14th adoption of the ordinance. So those are the meetings that we have scheduled at this time.
Leif, could you say one more time when in that series of events we'll be receiving the actual information?
That when you'll be receiving the the notification.
Census data.
Oh, I believe the final, now Leaf, you will have to correct me, but I think you said at the end of September, around September 21st, or possibly even this 14th.
Well, today I learned that census data for redistricting by the Census Bureau will be released on September 16th. But we have to use the state adjusted data, which hopefully won't be much later than that. However, we've been told by the state that we should plan on not getting it until the end of September. Hopefully we'll get it sooner, but they're sticking to that September 30th date.
And Paula, I see a hand you raised. And you're muted. You're muted there.
There we go. Are we going to confirm that each one of the just public input meetings are at 6:15? And also I had heard talk at one point about doing one on a weekend. Is that still, didn't look like that's included in this schedule. And who would determine when those meetings are? Do we now take over some responsibility for that, or does that stay with the CEO's office?
I think I can respond in part to that. So this is a proposed timeline that we offer to you, and we're right now still in the presentation. We're almost done. The next agenda item will be looking officially at that timeline and taking action on it. When it comes to public workshops, we can certainly add more public workshops. When it comes to the Board of Supervisors, which those meetings will be more integral towards after the maps are drawn by and proposed by your board. We do have limited timing for that, and we have added requested to add a special meeting as indicated. But what you've been talking about, what the group's been talking about is wanting to consider more public workshops, and I'm sure that is something we can do. The statute requires at least one meeting to be either after 6 p.m. or on a weekend. And so that is why we have one meeting that next meeting scheduled at 6:15 p.m. That is the minimum requirements of the statute. If this commission requested additional workshops, we can work with you on scheduling and try to meet those requests and needs.
Thank you.
So Chair, we have this final slide is with our assessor clerk recorder Katrina Bartlome.
Hello, everyone. And Kyle, it's very important to keep those horseback riding lessons. I've ridden all my life. So, so after the maps are drawn, what's next? Maps are drawn and approved. The date that we had was December 15th, 2021. The GIS, LEAF, and the Registrar of Voters determine which parcels or addresses are to be affected. Those affected are moved into the appropriate districts or moved into the appropriate lines. We work with our election management system, our EMS, and with our EMS vendor to help us get our procedures down, since we only do this once every 10 years. And we work very closely with that. LEAF will print us maps and show addresses, and it's really interesting what all happens. This process can take several weeks to make sure everything is correctly moved. We have to save and we have to resave, and sometimes we can do mass move, but most of the time it's pretty much address by address that we move. So the one thing that I would really like everybody to keep in mind, and not to rush you, but our candidate filing starts on June 16th, 2022. And that is where our candidates that are up for election can come in and get signatures in lieu to go against their filing fees. So, you know, that's just one thing. So if we drastically have to change a district, and a supervisor, candidate for supervisor comes in, we're not sure, you know, if he goes out and gets on the cusp of a district, then we're not sure if all of those signatures can actually count for him if they're moved out of the district. So just a very basic overview of that. We're working with tight dates, and as you guys are, and it's been kind of crazy this year. And now with this recall election, you know, it's like we don't have a whole lot of time, as you guys don't have a whole lot of time. And you know, I just can't express how sorry I am that everything was just so put together the way it is, and with our short deadline. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. If you guys have any questions for me. I'm the last one online, and I'm usually that's usually where I am. So
Thank you, Katrina.
thank you.
Is this where I make a motion to adjourn? Or do we need to vote to confirm the proposed dates?
I have a quick question on the presentation, if it's okay. I promise not to make it really
Yeah, of
long.
course.
I think this goes back to the federal criteria and the state criteria. And the state criteria, I waited to see if it came up again because I didn't want to waste our time. But this state criteria doesn't mention population at all. So the only clarification I'm asking about is, do we take both? Are we working under both federal and state, or does the state take priority over the federal?
If I may answer through the chair, the criteria that you must include or must address are the federal and state criteria. The state criteria does also address equal population. It's just based and historically based on federal constitutional principles, and that's sort of how it's oriented in that way. But it is a criteria to be considered, and it is in the among the ranked criteria to be considered.
Okay, thank you.
And if I may also, through the chair, answer the chair's question about what process stage we're at in the agenda. We have just concluded, the staff has just concluded agenda item 5 as to the Brown Act training and overview of redistricting process. I think we should ask if there's any public comment. I think Nadia, our clerk, can address that. And then we have 2 more agenda items, I believe. But I think they can be very brief depending on any comment and deliberation.
No public comment has been received for agenda item 5.
Okay. So I guess is this agenda item 6 would be a proposed agenda for upcoming meetings. But you can turn that over to staff.
So, yeah, through the chair. So for upcoming meetings, so this is we went through this information today, so we could discuss proposed agenda topics for the upcoming meeting for the 7th.
And through the chair, I believe there's a list of some proposed agenda topics. If there's any that the board, the commission would like to add, to have us add for the next meeting on September 7th, our first meeting after this, we can add that to the agenda. And so this would be the time to add, to direct staff as to things that you would like added to the agenda.
Anybody on the commission have anything they think we should add for the first one? I can't tell who raised their hand first, but go ahead, Peter. You're first on my screen.
I just wanted to request that we add an item on the agenda for the 7th to talk about community outreach, to make sure that we're getting the input that we need from the community in regard to these items. And that would be my request. to add an item 6D on a plan for community outreach or a strategy for community outreach.
Okay. Yep, there's Kyle.
Can I go? I think we should also add something, looking at the meeting schedule to see if we need to meet more often. And maybe after the first meeting, we get an idea of the flow of the meeting and what we're able to accomplish. We can better make that decision.
Go ahead, Paula.
Okay, I would like to request that as a standing item on this agenda, that we get a report on input received through that website to the commission from the public. So that just it's routinely given to us. Is that doable? Sherry, where are you? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so do we have those added to the proposed meeting? Yeah, Paula, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if there's no further business, I will make a motion to adjourn so you can get to your horseback riding.
I would second that motion.
If I may just ask if the clerk can confirm there has been no public comment, or if there's been any public comment on as to the items 6 and 7 of the agenda.
No public comment has been received for item 6 or for item 7.
Go ahead, Peter.
I think, I'm not sure if I'm, okay. I think we actually have to have a motion, if I'm not incorrect, to adopt these dates and the agenda as modified. And so I would make the motion to adopt these dates and the agenda as modified with the 2 items that were added by the commission members. And I would ask staff if they're clear on what those 2 items are.
For agenda item number 6, there has been consensus from the commission to add item 6D for community outreach. And we have also received consensus from the commission to receive all a report each meeting on all comment received that has not been agendized.
So I would,
Do I
Mr.
have
Chair,
a
I would
second?
motion to adopt that.
Do we have a second?
I would like to also add something, looking at the schedule, that we look
ahead,
at the
Dee.
schedule again to see if we need more meetings.
We'll add that.
Peter, would you like to amend your motion to include?
Yeah, I'll accept that amendment.
Okay.
Mary? Unmute, Mary. good.
As long as we can accept these meeting dates, but we are allowed on the agenda to consider new ones that we're adding.
Peter, is that your motion?
Yeah, I'll accept that.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
So I'll make a roll call. Dee,
Yes.
Mary,
Yes.
Paula,
Yes.
Peter,
Yes.
and Kyle, yes.
Okay.
Motion passes unanimously.
Do we have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
I so move.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
I second.
Okay.
Call that
We all
Paula.
second.
Thanks,
Chair,
everybody.
Chair, you can adjourn the meeting at any time.
All right,
I
thank you
hereby
very much.
adjourn the meeting.